Welcome everyone to the Miss and Escape co-sponsored talk with Dr. Jaime Snyder. Dr. Snyder is an assistant professor in the Information School at the University of Washington in Seattle. At UW, she leads a visualization studies research studio where her team uses qualitative and design research methods to engage in contexts where people from very different backgrounds with diverse types of expertise use visual materials to coordinate and collaborate. So I'm very excited to hear about this work today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm very, very, very excited to be talking about my work today. I mentioned when I first got on Zoom here, I have been focusing on remote learning for my second grader. So I might be a little rusty. I've been told that everybody makes that disclaimer, or a lot of people are making that disclaimer. I'm going to try to keep an eye on the chat and hands, but I'm not exactly sure what's going to be visible to me. Feel free to jump in if you have a clarifying question, and I'm going to really try my best to leave lots of time at the end for more discussion and interaction. So now I'm going to do the amazing feat of sharing my screen. We practiced this. Let's see if okay. All right. Can I get a thumbs up if you are not seeing notes? Okay, awesome. Okay, so right now I am an assistant professor at the Information School at the University of Washington. I also have an adjunct appointment in human-centered design and engineering. Come September, I will be an associate professor there. I'm really delighted to have gotten tenure during this COVID time. Today I want to do a couple different things. First, I'm going to introduce the work that my research studio does related to visualization studies. I want to talk a little bit about what that means and how that is different from related fields like information visualization, for example. And then give a really brief teaser about some of the current projects we have going on, and then really dive in more deeply with a project that is still kind of wrapping up, but happened over the last few years working with folks with bipolar disorder who self-track as a form of self-management. I do want to say that maybe about midway through the presentation, I will be sharing narratives from my participants about experiences with serious mental illness. I'll try to give you a heads up, but as soon as you hear me talking more in depth than that, if you want to step out, mute, just so that you're aware that that is coming down the road. So my work is really focused on understanding visual practices. And I've actually been doing this work for a really long time. Originally, my background and training was in studio art and painting and drawing. I have a BFA and an MFA in visual art. And for a long time, that was my primary practice, thinking about what it means to make a mark, to make an image, and what it means to stand in front of an image. And through that work, I became aware of and interested in user interaction design and information architecture, and started doing a bit of work, really honestly to pay the rent, but in the web development industry. And as that I kind of progressed having multiple full-time jobs, I realized that I really wanted to focus on just one line of inquiry, right? And that really led to the social science and information science work I'm doing now that has a very heavy influence, a heavy accent, I think of it, in art and design. So when I talk about understanding visual practices in a really general sense, I'm talking about what data is, how we represent it in the real world, and in what context it's being interpreted. Specifically, in my visualization studies research studio, we addressed three primary questions. One, what information and data are socio-technical systems designed to make visible? And by implication, what are they not designed to make visible? how are visual encoding systems defined for and by these systems, with this idea that these are designed choices. And we know from really great work on values in design that that design choices reflect the priorities of the folks who are making those decisions. And then lastly, what are the social and communicative implications of these design choices? These questions have been modified or inspired by the work of Rose and Tolia Kelly. Gillian Rose is a very well-known visual studies scholar. And their work looking at visuality and materiality offers a lot of great examples of how these questions sort of manifest in the world, in some ways through data visualization and information visualization, but in lots of other ways as well. So it's been really influential work to me. First of all, I absolutely have to give a call out to my student collaborators, Liam, Nikita, Justin, Taram, Yubing, and Anushka. Each of them have made fantastic progress in the last year under very difficult circumstances. They're doing really interesting work. We've got 2 of them going to PhD programs, really top-notch PhD programs, one going to her dream master's program, and 2 of them barreling towards really interesting general exams, and Anushka should be defending by the end of this academic year. I just want to say, and for any of the students out there, any progress is great progress these days, and just know that we are all trying to support you all as much as we can. So the approach that we take in the research studio is to really look at the creation and use of visual representations of information and data, and I would add knowledge, in contexts where people are collaborating, coordinating, and communicating. So really, this idea of social interaction is really important, and you'll see that thread through the work that I'm going to be talking about. I'm particularly interested in instances where stakeholders are coming with really disparate expertise and different approaches to sense making. So there is some idea of bridging gaps, of needing to establish common ground in different ways than or more challenging ways. I generally spearhead the qualitative and design methods that are used in the project, but I really enjoy collaborating with clinical researchers and system builders. I find that kind of balancing of theory and making and design work with applied contexts is really rewarding. So within that work, the sites of inquiry, the places that we go to look for these moments of visually enabled collaboration and coordination include the long-term management of mental illness, specifically bipolar, which I'll talk about today, and chronic disease. Increasingly, long-term management of things like chronic disease involve a degree of data literacies, and often the way that a multidisciplinary or a mixed team interacts with that data is through visualization. So you can think of patients, clinicians, and family members, for example. Affective computing and neurodiversity. This is really, I'm not going to talk about this too much because this is really the meat of Anushka's dissertation work, and I don't want to have any spoilers for her work. But really thinking about how we visually represent emotion in affective computing systems and how they relate to lived experiences of emotion by neurodiverse audiences, such as autistic people. And last, public engagement in science. I've been involved with a citizen science project for a number of years now, and we've looked very closely at the visual materials that they use in order to train, engage, and support their participants, their volunteers. And increasingly important, especially on the West Coast, are instances of mass mortality. So really large animal die-offs that are visible. Evidence of these die-offs wash up on the beach. People who have been engaging in citizen science for a long time because they want to support their communities are understandably distressed by these events. And so we're thinking about how we can use visual materials to help individuals, help citizen scientists process the emotions that go on with doing this kind of work in our current climate, literally our current climate. Before I get into the research activities, I wanted to zoom through some of the theoretical and conceptual work that has inspired me and continues to support this work. First, because of my focus not just on specialized visualization practices, but on the ways that visual representations are embedded in everyday life. I've drawn heavily on the area of everyday adaptive design. You can see in these images everything from DIY car fixes. Whenever I need images for this, I just search on duct tape and I end up with loads of great pictures. But this idea that design doesn't end when a product is launched, that people continue through daily use to adapt the tools and technologies in their world to do what they need to do. And that if we really look at these practices, we can learn a lot about user situations, user priorities, user values. We can also learn traditionally vernacular design, vernacular architecture also helps us understand what resources are available in different contexts. As I mentioned, my background is in image making. And as an artist, I've always been really fascinated with mark making out in the wild. So this is an absolute combination of high art, more indigenous art, computer generated art, prehistoric art, kind of incidental mark making in the form of the marks on the pavement. But all of these things have in common this idea that the mark, the evidence of a body in space is embedded in the visual artifact. And so that has always been very compelling to me and really interesting to think about what we can tell in that same way that when we look at adaptive design, we can, everyday adaptive design, we can learn about these day-to-day lived experiences. When we look at mark making, we can also be thinking about what we can tell about embodiment and presence in the world. This work really led to my dissertation work, which was on image-enabled discourse or spontaneous visual explanations. These are examples of the kinds of things that, that I looked at. And yes, I did do my dissertation on napkin drawings. I looked at not the drawings themselves, but actually did close social linguistic analysis of the conversations in which the images were produced to really try to understand what role that mark making played from a communicative practice perspective. And really this work established the foundation for looking at social interaction through image making that really still motivates my work today. Along the way, I have also a great interest in physical visualizations. These are all indigenous and more historical physical visualizations, but there's lots of folks who are doing great work in this area. Everything from visualizations for people with visual impairments to really thinking about how we, how data exists in the world. I'll leave it to you to figure out what data is being, or what information is being shown in some of these. If we were in person, I would probably ask for some guesses. If you want to put them in the chat, you can go ahead and do that. And lastly, a term that I have adopted that was first introduced by Vega and Wattenberg in 2007 is refers to vernacular visualizations. They wrote a relatively brief paper about what they called vernacular visualizations, really focusing on the word cloud. Now, if you ask any information visualization researcher, maybe some of you are here today rolling your eyes, you will hear them say, oh, word clouds, no, 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 just no, right? We know that there are what are called kind of glaring problems with the way that word clouds display information. However, we also know that people love them. People exchange them, people are inspired by them. They are doing something. And Hurston and Rosner did have a really nice defense of the word cloud. For the reasons that I've been talking about. What is it that make the word clouds helpful to us? How are they situated in these practices, in these communication practices? Why are these problems that we see from the perspective of InfoVis research, why don't they cut things off right at the gate, right? So I've taken this idea and extended it into other situations where people who are not necessarily trained in data science, statistics, data visualization, information visualization, are using visual representations to communicate and collaborate and coordinate around specific types of information. These are just some general examples that I have encountered along the way that, yes, I could critique each and every one of these from a graphic design perspective, from a visual communication perspective, from a data representation perspective, but that would miss the point of what these things are and how they exist in the world. So in terms of these sort of concepts, in the work that we're doing in the Visualization Studies Research Studio, right now we have about 4 projects, more or less, going on. I mentioned some of these already. Looking at visual materials to support public engagement in science through what we're calling, what has been called epistemic affect. That's the emotions you feel as you're gaining knowledge. And it has mostly been looked at in terms of formal science education in the classroom. We're interested in seeing if we can build out a schema, a taxonomy for epistemic affect in public engagement in science, and science when it happens out in the world. This is Anushka's work is looking at taking a critical visualization design perspective on affective computing outputs for autistic people. She's just wrapping up really interesting multi-phase grounded design study looking at understanding the role of emotion and technology for people on the autism spectrum, involving them in co-design. And I do also want to give a shout out that she was able to do this last summer in spite of the pandemic, and really innovated some really interesting ways to do co-design remotely. And now she's in the midst of an appropriation study working on a high fidelity prototype that she's created with graphic artists and with students, and kind of deploying that on a small scale with some of her participant collaborators. A project that I'm working on with a pediatric nephrologist at Seattle Children's Hospital involves looking at visualizations and visual representations to support collaborative decision-making between pediatric kidney patients and their families and clinicians. The idea that kidney disease, and particularly kidney transplant, involves a huge amount of very variable data that needs to be understood and interpreted on a daily basis. But most of that work happens at home. Medical treatments have progressed to a point that many things that you used to go into the hospital for can be performed at home, but it requires a whole different relationship with data. For the patients and the families and the caregivers, this is both empowering, but it's also daunting. So we're trying to look at ways that we can use visual materials to support that, that complex decision making. And last, I am involved in a project that was spearheaded by Dror Benzev, who's faculty in the Department of Psychiatry and co-director of the Bright Center at University of Washington. And he has done a lot of work looking at leveraging mobile health for mental health in hard to reach places. And we're involved in extending that work with our local partners in Ghana, where paraprofessionals who are often faith healers are on the front lines of giving support to people with serious mental health issues. Historically, this has involved some problematic practices related to human rights violations like chaining and forced fasting, that we are trying to see how minimal an intervention we can make in the form of educating these paraprofessionals in alternative approaches, if we can significantly reduce the number of human rights violations that are happening in this context. The idea is we're starting in Ghana. We have very strong partners there, both in the faith healer community and at the University of Ghana, and then extending it out into further out into West Africa. Specifically, probably our next kind of venture out will be in Nigeria. So that's just a quick teaser. I'm happy to answer questions, or if you're interested in any of these projects, try to grab a session. I know I sent out some times and days that I'm available to meet with you all. But for the rest of my time, I want to talk about the bipolar project. There are two publications that are, I think of as kind of sister publications that describe different parts of this project, different aspects of it. One was a Chi paper and one came out at Dis last year. So if you're looking for more details than my very surface level skim through that's a great place to start. So this work was supported by University of Washington Royalty Research Fund award and some funding from Group Health Foundation. First, a little bit about bipolar disorder for those of you who might not be familiar with it. It's a chronic mental health condition characterized by shifts in mood from highly elevated manic states to depressive states. These shifts can be quite severe and can happen over the course of days, weeks, months, or even years, and they are notoriously difficult to predict. Therapeutic self-tracking is often recommended along with medication and therapy as a means to manage bipolar, really self-manage. In addition to tracking mood states, people tend to track things like sleep, activity levels, social interactions, and spending patterns, using everything from consumer activity trackers like Fitbits to clinician-provided worksheets to worksheets that they create themselves. And what you see in this slide is examples of all of those things, right? One of the challenges involved in this kind of tracking is that it is based on self-report. And we are far from the point where data like this can be integrated into electronic health records in consistent ways. So our work is really motivated by a few things. One, within personal informatics, we're interested in collective engagement across stakeholder groups. So we have learned that it takes on average about 10 years for people with bipolar to be diagnosed. And during that 10 years, there's a lot of social, complex social dynamics that are happening, both with clinicians and with family and peers and things like that. So we're wondering if there's a way that we can better support that through the process of diagnosis and then self-management. We are very concerned with issues of social support, providing social support, but also recognizing that empathy, privacy, and empowerment are also important things to be considering and supporting. And this is my primary focus with the group, is the ways that we visually encode data that reflect lived experiences. And I'll be unpacking that a little bit over the next couple of minutes. Again, we have a paper here from CSCW a few years ago that lays out our approach. Again, giving a nod to all my fantastic collaborators. Each one of these, oh, and Liz is actually now an assistant professor at Dartmouth. I meant to update that slide, but I neglected to. Really, it takes a multidisciplinary team and people really willing to engage in some challenging work to make progress in this area. So one of our first studies back when Mark Matthews, Steve Voida, and I were postdocs at the Interaction Design Lab at Cornell, involved gathering some personal narratives of bipolar. So this is really the source of my thinking about lived experiences. I've included a few quotes from participants here. In a survey, we asked people with bipolar disorder how they describe their experiences to other people. Well, a number of people responded by saying they didn't talk about it because no one understands. Many others provided really rich statements. I'll just read the highlighted parts. That it's like being underwater and it's completely dark, and I can gradually see more light as mood improves. But mostly I stay just under the surface of the water, although it's very sunny. I think I once tried to describe the overall experience to someone as being both the storm and the ship caught in it. And high energy mixed episodes make me feel like I'm nothing but massive numbers of vibrating gas particles colliding into each other like a roiling cloud of anger and energy barely held together by my own skin. I pull these out because they, I think, are great examples of the complexity of the metaphors of the, clinically you call them mixed episodes. At times people will experience depression and mania at the same time, and it often comes out in this physical feeling of itching, vibration. It's very uncomfortable from the narratives that I have that I've heard. So I became really interested as Mark and Steve were developing an app called Mood Rhythm to track some of these day-to-day rhythms, right? I started looking at how this data was often visualized in self-tracking systems. And I really was struck by the ways that the conventional approaches to representing time series data that are typically used in these apps don't really reflect the complexities we heard in these narratives. They tend to rely on smoothing and other normative graphic conventions. And really there seemed to be a gap. So in the DIS paper, I talk in more depth about these visualization conventions, going back and looking at the early days of chronobiology in the middle of last century, and how these conventions were established in terms of really trying to draw out those regular predictive rhythms in our biological functions. And at the time, there was a lot of attention being placed on locating the locus of that beat of the rhythms, right? Is it outside of ourselves? We can think of that as the sun and the 24-hour circadian cycle, or is it internal to us? And is it individual? And so there were a lot of experiments done in training those rhythms in different ways. Now we know that they're largely internal rhythms that can be greatly impacted by external factors. Anybody who's experienced jet lag knows about that, right? So we can kind of mess with those rhythms, but they are something that is internal to us. As you look at the various apps that have been developed to track change over time, we can see that folks are exploring and thinking about different ways to visually represent these rhythms. But none of these examples involve collaborating or doing co-design with people who have an inherently different experience with their own rhythms. So I started really exploring alternative approaches to encoding personal data through co-design with folks who have been diagnosed with bipolar. what I mean by alternative approaches, the recent work by Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein related to feminist data science and feminist data visualization, really thinking about how we're going about that encoding process. We looked at ways that artists like Laurie Frick were exploring material properties of data art. I'm hoping to really dive more deeply into this area over the next year or so, really thinking, trying to figure out what we can learn from our colleagues who are doing work in computational art and data art in terms of how we're thinking about data and what knowledge we are thinking can come from data. And non-digital data experiences, again, pulling on that, those physical visualizations, but also work like the Dear Data project, which is a really interesting set of drawings, hand drawings that were exchanged between two information visualization folks, documenting their days and sending those postcards back and forth. So this idea that there are, how else can visualizations look? So with all of this in mind, this kind of motivation, we launched a multi-phase study, 3 co-design sessions, and then kind of sandwiched in there a collaboration with a graphic artist who happened to be familiar with bipolar disorder, had some personal experience with bipolar. So first we conducted 2 co-design sessions with folks with bipolar to learn more about what it's like, and not from a clinical perspective. I was very clear, first thing that I talked about was the idea that I am not a clinician, I'm a technologist. I'm not here to diagnose them or judge them. I just really wanted to know what it was like for them. And so the 2 co-design sessions, 1 and 2, I'll talk about exactly what we did during those, but we really used a series of different visual elicitations to help move that conversation forward. Then analysis and synthesis of the visual artifacts and the conversations that we had during those design sessions led into this collaboration with the graphic artist, where we developed a few design concepts. And then we had an evaluation session. The last co-design session was that assessment. Really quickly, we recruited through the National Alliance for Mental Illness, the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance, I think is the Campus Mental Health. All in all, I was thrilled that we worked with 14 people who have been diagnosed with bipolar, and that 11 of them returned. 14 did sessions 1 and 2. And 11 returned for session 3. For those of you who work with vulnerable populations, I think you recognize that attrition is a significant problem with working with these populations, understandably. And for them to come back when in some cases it was months later and keep working on this study was, in my mind, a testament to the richness of our interactions with each other. So the first visual activity was pretty straightforward. After asking them to spend about 20 minutes or so just sharing with me their story, I asked them to draw a line that represented their experience with bipolar disorder. Then I asked them to draw another line that represents someone who was close to them during that time. And then a third line that represents what would have been an ideal state during that time. Now, keep in mind that for our analysis and synthesis, we didn't just go with the visualization, with the drawings that were here. We captured on a tablet this drawing as it emerged and changed and altered, and looked at that
window.
So we looked at all of this in tandem. The second visual activity involved creating a more detailed timeline or diagram of events that included significant events related to their experience. And that's where you'll see some level of details. Oh, no worries. a level of detail of life events, maybe some clarification of where events happened and the degree of magnitude that they associated with them. But also some people were like, a line doesn't cut it. That's not helpful to me. So that became an important thing, like the images in the lower right-hand corner. Visual activity number 3 was taking those timelines and adding annotations that we offered to them. These annotations were a combination of core concepts that we pulled from a data visualization textbook, things that are related to issues that we think about when we're visualizing data, but also we mapped those to things that people talked about during the beginning interactions. And because we recognize that although some folks said, oh, I don't self-track, I don't like technology, whatever, they really did have systematic ways of checking in with themselves, of gathering that data, and of analyzing that data, again, in air quotes, because these are my terms, not their terms, right? So we were interested in whether they could apply this set of symbols that we provided. The last visual activity involved taking some of the key words that they used during our interactions and doing a Google image search. This was actually, I think, one of the most fun parts for me. And what we did is we put the words in, we looked at what came up, and sometimes they said, oh, no, that's not, no. And sometimes they said, yes, that's it. That is what it feels like. And as a result, we had this huge library with verbal annotations as far as what imagery resonated with the folks in this study. All of that, like I mentioned, we took the text, we took the images, the drawn images, we took the transcripts, the drawn images, the found images, and we did what's called a social semiotic analysis. This is an approach to analyzing visual data that breaks images down across 3 dimensions: the pictorial content, what is it a picture of? The discursive meaning, what did it mean in the context where it was created or used? And any other cultural or social significance the visual object might have. This approach to visual analysis makes it possible to unpack the very different meanings represented in the 3 images that you see here of an apple. The results from the analysis included 3 sets of findings that I'll talk about in a bit more next. But I really do want to just clarify, this social semiotic analysis is derived from visual studies and is really designed to help us understand the rich context in which an image exists. When we're talking about socio-technical systems that generate images, that becomes really, you can see that we can also map to that. You can think of it, well, this is what a retrieval system might, how a retrieval system might identify an image versus somebody who is a PC user who hates Macs or whatever. And the image in the middle is a Cézanne painting. Those cultural references and things like that, clearly AI is struggling with that or working on that as we speak. So first I want to touch on findings that are reported in that DIS paper related to looking at the ways that the individuals in our study adapted visual encoding conventions as they were drawing out their experiences. And I have 2 quotes here, and I want to be very clear that these are direct quotes from the participants. The first participant mentioned, in order to think about how to represent my experience with bipolar disorder necessitates like, how do we represent the self, and like, how do we visualize our experiences with ourselves in life? This was, I just asked her to draw a timeline, right? So really the level of richness of these experiences and identity work that this population showed that they were doing was really compelling and interesting, and really made me want to do right by what they were sharing with me. And Maggie, she just cut to the chase. She said, how do you draw crazy, right? And again, her word, this quote was coming from a conversation where we had been talking about, I specifically asked participants how they refer to their condition and what, how they describe it to people. So we saw examples of mixed states being depicted through shifts in color. Again, cycles and rhythms, these circular formats replacing a linear timeline. We saw them struggle with this idea of intensity, where I might go back and ask for this P19 on the bottom here, oh, was this really the most manic you've ever been? And the participant might say, actually no, but it's the time that I was untreated, unmedicated, and felt totally out of control. Later in my life, I definitely had a bigger surge, but that was because I tried to change medicine or something else happened, right? So this idea of relative intensity really doesn't appear in a lot of the conventions that we use to represent change over time. And then temporal breaks, you can think of these as plateaus where you almost time travel, right, from one state to the next with no transitions whatsoever. In that paper, I talk about things related to normative geometry, a normative temporality that underlie visual conventions that run kind of orthogonal to these ideas. I'm noticing time, so I want to kind of speed things up a little bit. The next slides have a lot of pictures, so I think they are a bit self-explanatory. As I said, when we did that social semiotic analysis, we identified visual content themes. A lot of folks referred to water and water in different ways, being underwater, riding on a wave, being tossed about in a storm. They also talked about ideas of tension and balance, this idea of this tug of war or the knotting of their kind of core being, this need to kind of stack and balance. So this sort of tension. And then, like I said, this very rich idea of nonlinear representations, fractals sort of exploding from the center out, and then this idea of lichen, which will come back for us in a couple of minutes. Sense-making challenges, again, these vernacular approaches to collecting, identifying, interpreting, and acting on how they're doing on a day-to-day basis. So we heard things from this idea that there's a line that you don't cross is not accurate. It's actually more of a band that you try to stay within, much more like a hurricane prediction. And one person also talked about the idea that there can be things like a bunch of packages on a doorstep that might not be alarming to anyone else, but when they see this and recognize that when they've come home from work every day in the last 2 weeks, there's been a pile like this, they realize that they are exhibiting manic behavior. Distortions, the challenge of understanding how to ground or base their assessment of what's happening. And then again, the nonlinear experiences of time that either it's hard to understand and practice wise decision-making. It's not always clear what the future holds. And this idea of yeah, they tell us it's gonna be this kind of systematic curve, this systematic process, but it more feels like a big tangled mess. Working with these ideas, I collaborated with a graphic artist and we came up with these 3 visual encoding concepts. This idea of rope. The idea was that these would all be animated in some form or another and that they would change based on the data that was being fed in. So the ropes kind of pull back and forth and the hands kind of change in space. The idea of water and water both shaping the terrain, but also being in constant movement and in constant flux, that the water, the movement of life going by can wear things down, but it can also cause things to kind of collect. And then this idea of lichen. And yes, we are in the Pacific Northwest, so lichen is a fact of daily life, right? But even folks who at first looked at this and said, nature's gross. I don't like to be out in nature. If I were sitting in a log next to this, I would be totally grossed out. Started to really think about the way that lichen grows and some of the other property of lichen. And when we gathered that feedback, really just quickly, we said, they shared, many people shared that the rope, they understood it, but it was just too simplistic. It's not just a matter of pulling one way or the other. The different rates of change and the effects of distortion and the nature imagery was really positive in this sense. But most people actually felt that it was too cold and it wasn't alive and it didn't feel like them. But when we got to the lichen, many people expressed interest and fascination even with the idea of growth edges changing at different rates. And this idea that they could be, their experiences could be depicted in ways that were segmented but interdependent within an ecosystem, and that there are cycles of decay and resilience that ensure future growth. It's not like it's an orchid that if you mess up and don't water it once, it dies, right? That there is an idea of change, but potential. Right now, we are in the process of taking this lichen idea and adapting it. We're doing a feasibility exploration to see what would happen if we took this concept and created it computationally and started animating it and simulating growth using personal data, the typical personal data. And it's really interesting work. We're hoping to run user feedback within the next quarter by the end of the academic year, and really be able to talk a little bit more about what it means to use this idea of biomimicry in visually encoding personal data, especially for vulnerable populations. So this is my last slide, really just to sum up this work in general, really thinking about the people behind the data, the instruments or instrumentation of the body, how we are making assumptions about metrics and what's an appropriate metric, and the idea that whenever we represent personal data, we're representing identity, and that that has challenges and responsibilities. Design and technical requirements that are derived from lived experiences. The process that we're taking on this, yeah, it's wicked fast, it's slow, not fast, and has taken various turns. But our design and technical requirements as we go into system building are not based on what we can get the technology to do. They're based on what we need to do in order to appropriately represent these lived experiences. Another thread that has become increasingly important to me is this idea of situated expertise, acknowledging vernacular data practices and the importance of sense making with data in many different situations by many different types of folks. Co-design and agency. I was just so struck by the number of people, both as we collected narratives and as I conducted this design study, that said, no one's ever asked me about that before. No one's ever asked me what it was like for me. They just were diagnosing me or they were mad at me, right? So recognizing that as technology designers, we do have some things that we can contribute, and witnessing these lived experiences is one of those things. Reflective transformations refers to the synthesis of change over time and things like perceived magnitude and comparisons, that this is a moving target. And the idea isn't to freeze it in time and space, but to really be thinking really carefully about how we can visually encode that type of transformation. So that's what I've got for you guys today. Some contact information. I see there's a question. Could you say a bit more about how you collaborated with the graphic artists? Like, what did you ask them to do? Did they have access to the data? And what role did this collaboration serve in the work, or what would have been lost if this collaboration hadn't been part of this project? Great question. So we identified the graphic artist. My research assistant at the time had connections with people who were graphic artists and illustrators. So we looked at, stylistically, looked at a number of them, thinking about what would be possible, or what style of illustration could be translated into a computational output, could be data driven. That was one of our criteria, because we didn't want to get something very lyrical and brushstrokey that would be that would kind of complicate things in a way that we were wary about. What we did, I had a series of, I'm trying to think, at least 3 collaborative work sessions with the graphic artist. They did have access to the data. They were on our IRB. And I also had gone through the process of analysis, so did a first pass through pulling out some of those visual themes and talking about why I thought they were interesting or how people talked about them. And from that, we went through, I think, maybe 3 iterations of design concepts where we kind of unpacked each concept that the artist came up with. The reason why I went with an artist is I have a visual art background, but I'm not an illustrator. It's not my in my skill set. And it ended up being quite helpful to have somebody whose sole focus was on that kind of work. Anybody who is trying to design a website at the same time that you're trying to program it, you might be familiar with that switching of your headspace that I have come to really appreciate now. Whenever I write a grant, I put in money for a graphic artist, because it's so valuable and improves the depth of what we're able to do. Let's see. Participants had a lot of diverse ideas for visual encoding. How do you balance creating a design that is both useful but not too hard to learn or use? Great question, and that's exactly what we're looking at for the visual or the user feedback that we're going to be doing with the proof of concept. The last co-design session, the assessment, was geared specifically at that and asking really pointed questions about their relationship with this imagery and how they could see using it. Again, I was extremely grateful and listened with a lot of intention to how they talked about mapping their experiences to these visual concepts, these visual encodings. And nobody came in and said, I'm a visual person, I love this stuff, right? But they all engaged. And I think that was because of the way the arc of the participatory design project, and that this was our 3rd encounter. They knew the project at that point. I was familiar with their stories, so there were moments where they weren't censoring that much. I don't think they were. And we could really kind of get down to it. So I'm curious. I was surprised. I didn't actually mention this. I thought they were going to love the rope. I thought the rope was it. I preferred the water. That was the first one that the designer had come up with, and I was like, oh, that's perfect. As you saw from their response, nobody picked those 2. It was the lichen, and so we spent a lot of time kind of going, okay, lichen. Are people going to be able to connect with that? And I think that once folks really started imagining it changing and animating, it started to become really resonant. That said, we are also exploring, when we do that user feedback session in coming weeks, we will be asking about other ecological systems that have similar characteristics, like the desert and like coral reefs. Coral reefs are a little bit delicate, but so that we might be able to take that computational back end that we're figuring out, that idea of growth and edge growth and things like that, and just modify, reskin it is an idea that my computational collaborators tell me it isn't totally far-fetched. So Robin, question, yeah.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. With some of the populations that you and your students work with, like those with bipolar disorder or autistic communities, sometimes visual data representations can be overwhelming or challenging. So I think that while designing better and more meaningful and nonlinear visualizations are like a big step forward, have you thought about opportunities to engage other modalities for displaying information like touch or audio? And I ask because in my own work, I'm thinking about how voice interfaces present information to older adult populations. So just curious, what are your thoughts about these parallels between visualizations and say like audio or voice representations of data?
It's a really great question, Robin. I can say in the work that Anushka is doing with autistic young adults, her work, and we have a CSTW paper that's going to be coming out very soon that talks about the framework she's created. She calls it a design map that looks at sensory, emotional, and social factors that influence the ways that autistic young adults engage with computer-mediated communication. So in the co-design sessions that she did, she included tactile, more expressive things. She's done work also related to voice and video conferencing. I think we also have encountered that with the work in Ghana, where initially I was brought in because of the relatively low literacy rate of the paraprofessionals that we wanted to support. We wanted to make sure that what the digital intervention that we created was highly visual, and it is. But we also recognize that the main language that most folks speak in the region that we're working in, very few people know how to read and write it. They know how to speak it. So relying on audio content, we have a video content that's in the app, but recognizing that translation and keeping that audio format is really important. So I think I also the project didn't get funded, but have talked to folks who work with older adults as they experience the disease progression of dementia and Alzheimer's, and how visual representations might play a role. I actually think that you're right. I think in that population, other forms of modes of communication are going to be more appropriate. But that's just my gut reaction. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. We're at the hour, but I would just want to thank Dr. Snyder for the really interesting talk. I put in the chat the link to where you can sign up for a meeting, and there's just a few spots left. So let's give a round of applause.
Thank you guys so much, and for putting up with my rambling entry back into talking about professional work. I'd love to follow up with you guys, even if you don't want to do a whole half hour, just to check in. I'm also seeing some familiar names and faces out there. So hello to everybody who I know. I hope everybody's well and stays safe.